Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, partnering with donors from all walks of life to improve southeastern Virginia through grants, scholarships, and leadership initiatives. Learn more at hamptonroadscf.org.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another view coming to you live from the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Today's special broadcast is an Another View history lesson on the little-known contributions of Blacks during this country's fight for freedom as we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Historians Christy Coleman and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander are our special guests, and we will take questions from our live audience. So we want you to stay tuned. Another View will be right back after this national, regional, and local news from NPR and WHRO News.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Today we are live from the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown in front of a beautiful audience of folks who love history, yay, and folks who love Another View. Now, support for today's broadcast comes from Colonial Williamsburg and the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. Today, we're going to fill in the blanks about the contributions made by Black people in the fight for America's freedom. So let's meet our guests. Christy Coleman is an American historian and the executive director of the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation and former president and CEO of the American Civil War Museum. And Christy, you're also my boss. Well, I guess. But welcome. We can clap for Christy. And Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander is an award-winning historian and author. She is the endowed professor of Virginia Black History and Culture and the emeritus director of the Joseph Jenkins Roberts Center of African Diaspora Studies at Norfolk State University. Hey, Cassandra. Hi. I am so happy to have this conversation with you ladies. So before we get into specific stories and so forth, I have this question for you. How difficult has it been for historians to unearth the truth about the contributions of Black people during the Revolution? How hard has it been for people to start to accept, maybe, the real history? Christy?
Well, first of all, it is not hard to find the information. It is a willful, until I guess maybe in the last, since after Quarles's work, it was a deliberate removal, honestly. The records have always been there in terms of who was serving, where they were serving, what happened to them, what acts of valor that folks had. It's been there in the historical record the whole time. And it's unfortunate that that history has been ignored or deemed less important. And so for us, it's just been a matter of bringing it back out. I would say that the problem comes in when you are introducing these ideas into, for us, for example, into exhibition and program, is that people look at you as if you're doing some kind of DEI thing, which makes me crazy. I'm just going to say it right out front, right? Because that's not what's happening. The diversity of this nation is from its origins.
From the very beginning.
The protection and the being of this nation is from its origin, even when, and in the lived experience of folks of enslavement, right? It did not stop people, and clearly, let me just put it this way, the reality of enslavement, the declaring of freedom was something that was happening long before July 4, 1776. You know, black folks were declaring their own freedoms in their day-to-day actions as well as in choices, choosing to leave that enslavement and find other places to live, creating societies for themselves, sometimes in the swamps between Virginia and North Carolina, maroon societies and all of that. So the information, again, has always been there. It's a matter of weaving it back into our national narrative.
Cassandra, you want to add anything to that?
Yes, thank you. Well, you know, W.E.B. Du Bois, got my words all confused here, wrote a book at the turn of the 20th century entitled The Souls of Black Folk. And in that, he said that the 20th century, the problem in the 20th century is the color line, or will be the color line. And I would say that that problem still exists today, because it was in the 20th century that all of these images, I call them Disneyland images of our past, was put into place, circulated, put into textbooks, repeated in every single major American narrative. It hypnotized us about our past. It gave us the illusion of our past, so much so that you have people today who wish that they had a time machine so they would go back to that past. And I remind them, if you went back to that past, it would not be what you think. You will not be sipping mint juleps on a veranda somewhere. You would be working in a factory. You would be working on a farm. You would be doing hard labor. You would be filthy, dirty, smelly, and probably underfed. And they look at you in horror. Why? Because they've been brainwashed, they've been hypnotized about our past. Even the image, for example, the first arrival, well, it was forced arrival of the Africans. And of course, they said Jamestown. It was both called the Jamestown colony as well as the Virginia colony at that time. And when you look at those different images, people think those are historic. They were done in the 20th century, not in the 18th, not in the 17th, in the 20th century, and it wasn't even of this region. And those of you who know what this area looks like, and you know what Old Point Comfort looks like, which is where Fort Monroe is, you know that could not possibly have been there at that time. But those images are powerful. That's why I've been an opponent of allowing Confederate monuments to be in public spaces, because they send a visual and powerful message about something that is not real. And that embeds itself into your psyche in ways that is difficult to push back on. So the same thing is true for this whole history. You have a lot of white historians who never ever heard of Benjamin Quarles, who wrote the definitive book on blacks in the American Revolution. And today, there's nothing that a historian has written so far about blacks in the American Revolution that Benjamin Quarles did not put down back in 1961. 1961. But most white scholars, because the way that the academy is set up is you are trained by other historians, by other scholars, and if they are completely unaware, uninformed about the literature, about the manuscripts that have come out from all scholars, then they're going to teach you based on what they were taught. And that was certainly true when it comes to this topic. There's a man recently who won this big award. I think he won a Pulitzer Prize talking about the American Revolution, and did not once include anything about black people in his book. And I asked him the question, how are you talking about Yorktown and there are no black people mentioned when 1/4 of the troops on both sides were black? How do you have this in 2025? This was in 2020. How do you have this in a book that just got published? And not to mention, how did scholars read his work and not point that out?
Point it out to him.
But how do you write this in 2025 and completely overlook even just that one incident, not to mention the entire narrative, but it has to do with this narrative has to fit into our very narrow narrative about freedom. And if you don't include black people, then it's easy to argue the war and America was all about freedom.
So what is one myth, I'm sure there are many, but what's one myth that you wish would just disappear from the narrative? If if nothing else, if you could get people to stop thinking X.
That America was founded on Christian principles. I wish that would go away because it was not. There were people who talk like that, but it's just like the people who are Christian nationalists, who talk about God from the perspective that only white people can be Christians. I'm sorry, what? What are you talking? This has nothing to do with the scripture. You just have your own hate that you baked into that. And so I think people need to stop talking about this as a Christian nation. The nation was founded on the principle of finding money, getting money. that was settled with Price's book when he looked at the origin of Jamestown, and they can talk about Plymouth all they want to. Plymouth was a part of Virginia, but most of the people who settled in Plymouth were not pilgrims. They were not part of that separatist group. So we need to stop with that particular mythology.
Okay, Christy, you got one?
Oh, Lord.
Pick one, right?
Pick one, right. A myth about the American Revolution era. Okay, here's one. That slavery didn't exist in all 13 colonies. That it was purely a Southern phenomenon. And the truth of the matter is, every single one of the original 13 colonies were slaveholding. The difference was those in the South, it was the slave economy, which is different, right?
Yeah.
So that's one. And, I would also say that, I don't know if it's myth, but actually more adding to the importance of the narrative. The American Revolution, the Declaration of Independence specifically, as it was being written and as it was being debated, this paradox was extremely apparent to all of the delegates in Philadelphia. Every single one of them understood the paradox that they were espousing and the language that they were espousing in their argument against the king, right? And to extricate themselves, for lack of a better phrase, they put in language that says, and he forced upon us this system of enslavement of other men. They kind of, it's really interesting language. Go back and look at it, right? and so that's the other thing. But what it does is that, the myth, if I were to kind of refine this, is this idea of, well, they were just men of their own time and they didn't understand it. Or they didn't, that mythology, that's an excuse that we use. There are people of conscience in every generation and every era. And this discussion, this debate, actually does lead to either outright abolition of slavery, where it was economically feasible for some to do so, that would be their language, right? Gradual emancipation, or where they would pick a date in the future that any person born after that date or whatever, or up to a certain age, would then become free people. And they made manumission easier in some of the southern economies. So I know that's a long answer, but again, when it comes to sort of mythology, the mythology that, again, slavery was just a southern phenomena is the first part, and then the second part is this idea that they were not, because of their time period and this existence of this enslavement system and transportation of African peoples was somehow, well, that's just how they did it. They understood very, very well what they were doing. and lots of treatises were written about it at the time, especially after the Declaration was published widely.
So I know that we're going to talk a lot about the some folks here in Virginia and the things that they did. But before we get to that, I want to ask a question that I've always been curious about. So we know Crispus Attucks was the first person killed as this war began, right? But what else do we know about him? Because that's the only thing, if you look in the history books or whatever, that's all they say. What do we know any more about him? Because, and it's getting to the point of the larger point of how we just kind of put these people in a box as if they never existed outside of the thing, you know, that they're being recognized for.
He was from New York. He was formerly, well, I say he's formerly enslaved. He was enslaved, and he claimed his own freedom by running away. And he ended up in Boston working as a seaman. And a lot of people don't realize that no one cared what your status was if you worked at what we call merchant marine today. Nobody cared what you did, who you were, where you were from, whether you were free or enslaved, because the demand was high to have competent seamen transporting goods back and forth. And so he was caught up in this shift in America at the time that was barred by England from continuing to bring goods on American ships back and forth between any of the islands. You know, according to English law, the Navigation Acts, you were only supposed to have English ships transporting goods back and forth between England, the English colonies, and on English ships. Populated by English seamen aboard those ships. And Boston made its money by trading with anybody and having anyone serving aboard their ships, all Americans. And so he was one of those. That's a little bit, I'm sure there's a lot more. What's really, I think, important is that even his persona got changed over time. So, you know, when they first started publicizing Crispus Attucks, he was a white man. He was depicted as white in all of the illustrations and so forth. And then,
if he was depicted at all.
Yes.
Wow.
And then, you know, he eventually became black. Sometime in the 19th century, he became black. Black people in Norfolk knew about his history, which is why they named the theater that they built with their own money, that they designed. It was a black architect who designed the Attucks Theater. And the person who was who did the mural, which was their curtain, they wanted to make sure that people were reminded of this history every time they walked into that theater, that they would see Crispus Attucks and the scene of the Boston Massacre.
Right. I would add this, and again, this is about how historical memory shifts over time, right? So when the Boston Massacre first occurred, at least here in Virginia and in a few other colonies, it was decried as bad actors, meaning those individuals who got shot. Right? That were standing up to the British regulars that were in their streets and quartering in their homes and creating havoc in Boston at the time, right? And so it was, they're just, you like this term, agitators. And the same thing was said during the Boston Tea Party. And once again, the Boston Tea Party, what happened with Crispus Attucks and the others in the Boston Massacre, right? Excuse me. Over time, those become anchoring events of resistance. But at the time, these folks were viewed as agitators, troublemakers that caused their own deaths. And so it's really, really interesting. And Crispus Attucks ends up being elevated pretty quickly. All things considered. Like I said, those initial reports, those initial newspapers reports where they did the etchings of him or of the individuals, you know, and everything is so dramatic in those woodcuts. But they eventually do darken him, in the presence of Crispus Attucks. And there's been some suggestion that he also had indigenous heritage as well. But he's and then pretty soon he is front and center within 10, 15 years or so of the recounting of that, especially once we get to actually end the war. Crispus Attucks becomes front and center in that scene, which is, again, another very deliberate choice about how we're going to remember these events. And so I think it's, again, quite telling the way he has evolved over time. People know the name, but may not know
That's why
his
I was asking the question,
background.
yeah.
And, he's, and he has this peculiar space in American life. As was mentioned by Cassandra, that, you have black communities begin to name things after him. He is held up as, a prime example of our blood was the first to be shed for this nation. Therefore, we should be, it's that kind of thing is how the African and African American communities are looking at Crispus Attucks. Abolitionists in the 18th century are looking at Crispus Attucks as, worthy men. Black people are worthy of freedom too, right? And then you have others who just kind of like, okay, we'll remember his name, but at the end of the day, his death doesn't mean the same thing to us, right? And so again, I think in the American popular culture, we may know the name, but we may not fully understand the scope of what was happening and how he is used over time. And if I could make a comparative, it's almost like they sanitized him in a way. Because of his work on the ships and working in the docks and working class and really against the taxes, and I mean he's got that same kind of energy, but he's kind of sanitized as sort of this martyr figure, right? Well, a similar thing happened with Rosa Parks in the 20th century. She was just tired and just didn't want to give up her seat, which completely eliminates her entire history involvement in the civil rights. First of all, she is a strong advocate and activist against the rape of black women by white men who would never see a day in court for it. So that was her first thing. Then she was into, she was also working in the anti-lynching campaign. She's involved in legal defense work in the civil rights story. She's doing all of this. And so the decision for Rosa to get on that bus was calculated from the beginning. They already had a couple of other cases that had already happened, but they weren't the right people. Right? They weren't, you got a teenage mother, who was seen as a little hothead. You had another lady who was seen as less refined. And so Rosa became the person they said, you know what? Let them try it with you. Right? And so, and that's what happens. And so, all of her history, all of her background, all of her activism, all of her engagements in making America a more just place is dismissed as the tired seamstress who just didn't want to give up her seat, right? And so I think there's a similar kind of thing that happens, in the either further past. We have this, and it's an interesting thing. I used to give this talk years ago. I haven't done it in at least 6 years since I've been with Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. I used to do this talk called that looked at how shall we remember, and how shall we remember looked at this difference between history, heritage, and memory, which are three very distinct things that inform how Americans think about their past. History is the documented. History is the forensic, right? The forensic material. Heritage is what we choose to do with it to make ourselves as a cohesive society. That's a very different thing. That's the George Washington chopped down the cherry tree and couldn't tell a lie, neither of which are true. But as a society, we needed that. You know, even saying George Washington had wooden teeth,
yes.
was a lie. A distinct and grotesque lie, right? And so we need this sort of heritage making, or we think we need heritage making, and I would argue that we're in that phase again, where this idea of if we could just be cohesive and have a history that is positive and supportive and makes us all feel good, and no one group should feel bad, and if y'all would just shut up about that other stuff, we'll be fine. That's heritage making, but it's not necessarily history. And more often than not, it's not history. And then there's the memory piece. And the memory piece is our personal experiences with that past. So whether we are from a descendant community and have stories that are passed down to us, or you know, we remember going to a place and how we felt in that space, right? There are people that love going to battlefields, and they feel this sort of thing when there is a sense, there is a power to place, and place is powerful, right? So that individual memory creates things too, right? I mean, it used to, a shout out to one of the sponsors for the show. I'm sorry that Jamestown isn't, but we'll work on that.
We'll be happy to have you join us.
The Colonial Williamsburg, when I was first starting out in this business, right? And we, you know, the memory piece, there used to be people that would come through and literally get mad because we weren't churning butter or making candles anymore. I mean, mad. You know, they're like, why aren't you doing that? And we used to love coming here to churn butter with the people and the this, and they're not dipping candles. Why? Because historically, the forensics, you bought it. You didn't have to do it. And they certainly weren't doing it in the capital city of the wealthiest of the 13 colonies. Give me a break, right? But our memory of that experience becomes really powerful. And so those are the kind of things that I talk about. And so, like I said, going back to your original question, this is part of the reason why Crispus Attucks has this very fluid and very odd thing. We can't quite figure out what to do with him across that. But forensically, historically, this is what we know about him.
If you're just joining us, we're coming to you live from the American Revolution Museum at Yorktown with the Another View history lesson on the contributions of Blacks in the Revolutionary War. My guests are historian Christy Coleman and Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander. Those of you listening to us live on the radio, we will not be taking phone calls this time, but we do have a live audience with us. And so if, audience, you have questions at any time, just please move to the sides and we will be glad to take your questions. All right, let's make some folks real, since we want to talk about the history, and we can throw some heritage in there too. But
well, could I just do a side note?
Sure.
Because Christy brought up something important when she talked about Crispus Attucks and about Virginia in particular. Virginians were not in favor of joining those New Englanders and those troublemakers up north in resisting the British and eventually leaving covering the authority of the British Empire until Lord Dunmore decided that he was going to be proactive in stopping anything happening in Virginia. He was hearing some rumblings, but he decided he was going to stop it. And he needed additional people because he was expecting a flood of white Americans to come and support his efforts. And he didn't get as many as he expected because by 1775, there were already these committees of correspondence that had been put in place at least a year prior to that to convince many of the people, especially the voters, the white males who owned property, who owned a lot of property, to support one side or the other. And so he decided he was going to call upon primarily enslaved black men to help him to put down, to create fear. Now, was his intention to actually have a regiment filled with black men that he would call the Ethiopian Regiment? No. He wanted to use that as leverage to scare the heck out of white people in Virginia to make sure that they stayed loyal to Britain. And they did not. In fact, the opposite happened. Those who were in support, as soon as he called upon black men to help, to support his cause, all hell broke loose. And suddenly, white male Virginians decided they were going to support the American effort, because how dare he try to use these enslaved men against us? And it created this tremendous, America's always had a fear of black people rising up against white people and killing them. That has been there since slavery evolved in this country. And so that's reaching deeply into people's cultural perceptions and attitudes. And it's also a very human thing. If you've done some terrible things to somebody for a long time, you don't turn your back on that person. And you certainly don't go to sleep with them right there. And if you do, there's a part of you that's always on high alert. In fact, Martha Washington talked about that, because that's why she freed or sold all of the enslaved people 2 years after her husband died. She was fearful, hugely fearful, that she would be murdered in her bed by these people that white society basically said, oh, they love being enslaved. And they love their kind master.
But her situation was interesting, because the will actually said that they would be freed after her death.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, and she was very scared that they were going to kill her.
Exacerbate that situation. Yeah.
But I want to just finish up my point, and that is that Virginia shifted for that reason. It involved race. And yet, when we talk about Virginians and the American Revolution, we like to bring up Richard Henry Lee and how he was the first to, issue or put into play the proclamation to separate, to declare independence at the Continental Congress. But he did it long after what happened in Virginia in 1775 with Lord Dunmore. And so I think people need to know that there was not this constancy, this universality of how all the Americans thought the same way. There was change, and that change often came as a result of what was happening among African Americans in this country. And how, as soon as you evoke this fear of a slave revolt, this fear of arming a black man, especially, it didn't matter really if he was free or enslaved, but especially if he was enslaved, it changed the dynamics. And very few historians, even today, include that still in the narrative.
And I think it's important to understand, too, that why Dunmore's proclamation in Virginia, that added level of fear, is that, again, the capital city is 52% black. The colony itself is 40% black. This is no idle threat if people chose to follow him to seek that freedom that he was promising. We know it was a political move. We know it was a military strategy, but it was no less effective, even if he didn't actually mean to go through with it, right? It was no idle threat.
I believe we have a question from our audience.
Hi, I'm Martha from Newport News, and there's one thing I wanted to talk about, and that is the role of propaganda in the Boston Massacre, and how we have forgotten that there were battles down here in Virginia that were equal to, and actually more than, the Boston Massacre. And that is the Battle of Great Bridge.
Right.
And the hero, so to speak, of the Battle of Great Bridge was a free black soldier named Billy Flora.
Yes, we were just getting ready to get to that.
And this leads into victors get to tell the history. So why is it that we all learn about New England history, and I'm a New Englander by birth? It is because that's the history that got written first. But it's important to remember that here in Virginia, Billy Flora was at the Battle of Great Bridge and saved those Virginia soldiers from being massacred by the British.
Thank you so much for that. Let's bring Billy and others to life. Who wants to start?
Well, you know, most of the little areas in Hampton Roads were, you know, you think of the city of Norfolk, or at that time it was the borough of Norfolk. You know, it was essentially where Main Street is to the waterfront. That was Norfolk. That was the borough, town of Norfolk. That was it. Everything else was Norfolk County. And today, part of Norfolk County is now in Chesapeake. And so, but also a part of Norfolk County was this little teeny town called Portsmouth. And that's where William Flora lived. And that's where he would have his business. And William Flora was like a lot of black soldiers who were recruited to serve in different militias. These were state militias or colonial militias initially. Many of them were enlisted as privates. Unfortunately, most of them did not even, they were not, when they were enlisted, they were not even given a surname. They would just write down their first name, if they wrote down the name at all. There was a level of disrespect towards them. But at the same time, what's interesting is very seldom did they identify the person who was enlisting them. Did they identify them as black or white? And so sometimes it's hard to figure out who was who because of how they were listed. And as a result, there's this big narrative that circulated for a long time, and clearly they never read Benjamin Quarles's book, that there were no black people who served in any of the Virginia regiments during this period. It really wasn't common knowledge until the Daughters of the American Revolution opened up their archives, put it online so that you could actually see it. But even then, it's not, you know, there's a lot of information that you don't really know about because they don't list everybody by race. And usually, if you don't see race listed, you assume the person is white. But that's not really the case. Yeah. There were some black people who were actually identified as black in that, but many were not. But William Flora was someone who had tremendous courage, savvy, and there was an unnamed black man also who provided false intel, because a lot of black men worked as double agents, as did a lot of black women. And he gave false intel to the British soldiers about this important connection. Because for those of you who are not from Virginia or from this area, Great Bridge is the only land bridge that connects the rest of us to the continent of North America. That's why if you live in Great Bridge, you're going to have more storms, you're going to have more weather activity in that area because you are a part of a land bridge. And that was a critical land bridge, which is why you have the canal that goes through that intercoastal canal. That was an important waypoint, and the British felt if they conquered that area, if they took that area, they could cut off this entire region and control it completely. Because Norfolk was, despite what Richmond's trying to still do today, Norfolk is the port of Virginia. And that was an important area to have control of, this port, because it connects so much. And of course, you couldn't go to North Carolina, in the northern part of North Carolina, because the Outer Banks area, traversing that waterway was very treacherous to most ships. That's why they call it the ship's graveyard. And so Norfolk was the important access point. And that's why William Flora, what he did, by running in and removing some of the planks from the bridge, and being able, the only one who didn't run, he stood there with his weapon, which he had to keep reloading, fired at the troops 8 times while he was out in the open, so to speak. But he had the sense of the presence enough to do all of this, which held back the British forces, and it won the day for the Americans.
Wow. The book you keep referring to is The Negro in the American Revolution. It's by Benjamin Quarles. There's a 50th anniversary of the original that is out.
Yes.
Out
And you
now.
can pick one up in our gift shop.
There you go. See? Let's take another question from our audience.
Hi, I'm Devanna from Chesapeake. I really, first of all, love that you guys are having this show. And Dr. Newby-Alexander, you kind of went there to talk about Black women, but I wonder if you could talk more about Black women's participation, contribution to the fight for revolution. I know that, for instance, Lucy Terry's poem Bars Fight, right, kind of recounts some struggle for freedom, but in particular in this area, could we talk more about Black women? I'm thinking about Abigail Adams said, "Don't forget the women," right? So can we talk more about the women?
Okay.
Yes.
Now, we got 15 minutes left in the show, you two.
All right.
I'm just
So
saying.
I'll make it quick.
And then I want to get Christy in there too, so go ahead, you start.
So this is an area, especially for Virginia history, that is wide open, that needs some researchers in it, because there are only some mentions. The one that's most intriguing to me are the huge number of Black women who left with the British and are recorded in the 1782 lists of those who went to Halifax, Nova Scotia. Mm-hmm. And many of these women had children who went with them. If they were with a man, they didn't list them as such. There, occasionally you would see these family groups mentioned, but these women were laundresses, they were cooks, they were nurses, and so forth. And sometimes they didn't name exactly what skill they may have had or what job they had. But these women had to have done something to support the British forces. And not much is said, but we know that there are references to a lot of Black women giving intel to the American side or to the British side about what was happening, because they were looking at their families and protecting their families. And I always think about, up in Massachusetts, we had Mabette, who, at the end of the American Revolution said, well, wait a minute, Massachusetts, and this woman was enslaved. And she filed a lawsuit against Massachusetts saying, we fought a war to basically have our independence for freedom, and yet I'm still being held in bondage. And the Massachusetts Supreme Court agreed with her and freed all the enslaved people because of her efforts. And it seems like there were some Black women in Virginia who may have been involved in helping to provide a lot of support for these soldiers who were coming in, like the Rhode Island first that came down, that had 2/3 of the troops were Black from Rhode Island coming to fight in these wars here, as well as thousands who served in the 1st and 2nd Virginia regiments that became part of the Continental Army. So there seems to be some information that says they supported them with their skills as well as spies.
Yes. Okay, we'll go have a question over here.
So my yes/no question is, are Woodville, Rosenwall, and Bray schools connected in any ways other than, obviously, they were for Black children?
Connected to the American Revolution?
Connected to each other?
No.
Oh.
Okay.
No, they were different enterprises.
Okay, thank you,
With
but
the
for the
same
same
purpose.
purpose.
Yes.
And for the same reasons that you mentioned.
Yep.
And I also have a commercial, because in Gloucester, we now have the Civil War, why do I always say the Civil War? The Civil Rights Trail.
Yes.
And a wonderful history museum. If you come, you can get a brochure and go visit them yourselves. It's really cool.
Thank you
so
for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's all kinds of history here. Do we have another?
Yeah, you got
Okay.
one coming right there.
I think someone's coming out. Yes.
Yes, I often heard the slaves were the economy for this nation. And I'm going to ask a question. Ms. Coleman, did I hear you say one time on Barbara's show that in that era, 75% of the cotton in the world was created by the slaves? And after that answer, what do y'all think about reparations?
Okay.
Okay.
So, actually, what I
That's
would
a whole
have said
nother
to you
conversation, but go ahead.
is that on the eve of the American Civil War, you know, so on the 100 years later, there's about, right? On the eve of the American Civil War, 90% of the world's cotton was being produced in the American South.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
It's incorrect, somebody said?
It's incredible, she said.
Oh, incredible.
Yes,
Okay, I was
that's
going to say, wait a
incredible.
minute now. I know this one. Like, show me, because the materials that I've read on that one. Yeah, which you know, was part of the reason why the Confederacy believed that the rest of the world would come and recognize them. And Britain was close to doing it. The Vatican was close to doing it, right? But they also had stockpiled cotton, and they, particularly England, had a backup plan. And that backup plan was 3 locations. Egypt. Y'all look like you're Egyptian cotton, don't you? Right? So the backup plan for the English was Egypt, China, and India.
Wow.
And so today, China produces, I think, more than 30 or 40% of the world's cotton is in China. Refined or fine cotton is still produced in India and Egypt. But that's to the answer to that question. Now, to the question of reparations, I will say that I'm of a mixed opinion about it. And when I say mixed opinion, I don't necessarily lean into the enslavement period. I would say that America's reparations piece really should probably begin with the 20th century denials. So the black soldiers who didn't get the GI Bills, the black farmers who still have not gotten equity for their business loans, for their crops and things of that sort. And I'm actually a descendant of a black farmer who was chased off his land for demanding equal pay for his crops, right? That our family lost a portion of our lands in Dothan, Georgia, right? And so there are, I would say, the bank systems, the redlining, all of that is real easy, real detectable, very easy to track, very easy to trace where American policy, even, we even had the Fair Housing Act, right, that comes about. And, you know, all of these things that were happening that were not, that black people did not have equal access to, even though their taxes, because black folks paid the same level of taxes, and they watched their monies for their taxes go to white schools while they had under-resourced black schools. Not underperforming, under-resourced, right? And so for me, reparations looks like, let's just take a look at the past 100 years, for God's sake, and the families that were denied equal access and equal protection under the law, and all of those things that the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment said should happen.
Christy, we only have 3 minutes left.
Oh, goodness gracious.
So, but I got to talk to you about this because, first of all, I think that the celebration of America 250 means
Yes,
all of it.
all of it. Yes.
All of it. You were the historical consultant for the Gray House. If you have not seen the Gray House, it is on Prime. It is fantastic. Can you just talk a little bit about your experience with that? And I was looking, as I was looking it up, they were saying that it's a more of a memoir, not a memoir, but a tribute, I guess, as opposed to a documentary.
They said inspired by.
Inspired by.
It's
That's the word I was looking for,
because,
yes.
It's a spy network, so they had to kind of make up stuff, right, in terms of what actually happened. But it is historically based on real women. And most of the characters in it were real people that were included. So yeah, I served as consultant for Kevin Costner and Morgan Freeman and Laurie McCreary and Leslie Grief, who were the executive producers for the Grey House miniseries that's airing on Prime. And it was a 4-year thing. It is the 4th television or film production that I have served as the historical consultant for. I did it for Ethan Hawke and the Good Lord Bird. I did it for, Lord have mercy. I did it for Harriet with Disney, which I'm not real pleased about, but that's another story. As I tell people, they may pay me to be the consultant. It doesn't mean they have to listen. So anyway, yeah, Grey House, if you have an opportunity, by all means. It was a 4-year project, and in that one, I was involved in script rewrites for years, on-set stuff, taking them to museums and collections so they could try to get the clothes right, the costuming right, took them to real places that they could photograph that they tried to recreate in Romania where it was shot. So it was an extraordinary adventure, and again, thank you for that.
I tell you, when I saw the credits, I was just screaming.
I know her. Yeah, I was really quiet about it up until it was like 2 weeks before airing because I was under non-disclosure. So,
Gotcha.
So yeah.
All right, we have less than a minute.
Less than a minute.
I need one thing you want people to think about as they go through this whole celebration, commemoration this year. Just one thing you want them to think about, Cassandra.
Please think about the fact that we are still grappling with our past. And so when you see this commemoration, focus on what's left out and hopefully advocate that we stop with our false narrative, that we really, I don't like to say inclusive history, that we tell the truth, that we tell the truth about our past.
Dr. Cassandra Newby-Alexander, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
And Christy, you got the last 20 seconds or so, 25
I
seconds.
I promise I won't take 20 seconds. So I would say similar, but a little, I would simply say that American history belongs to all of us and all of its shades and all of its, and we do ourselves a disservice when we don't look at the completeness of what that narrative history tells us. Because there is often cause and effect. There is often influence that leads to decision making. And if you're leaving those pieces out, you're missing the catalysts.
Christy Coleman with the Jamestown Yorktown Foundation. And audience, we hope that you've enjoyed this special edition of Another View. Now, you can listen to this broadcast or any of our programs at whro.org or on your favorite podcast platform. Next week on Another View, it's another newbie. It's Dr. Keith Newby with Another View on Health. Our theme music is an original composition created especially for Another View by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer. Jordan Christie and Victor Bowen are the audio engineers for this on-location broadcast, and Dr. Barry Graham monitored the program from our studios at WHRO Public Media. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. Thanks to our audience here in Yorktown and to all of you listening on 89.5 FM. Let's get together again next Thursday at noon for Another View.
Support comes from Hampton Roads Community Foundation, carrying out your charitable wishes forever, whether it's helping shelter animals, feeding the homeless, enhancing the arts, or supporting students. Learn more at leaveabequest.org.